The sun lay low over the edge of the world, its last light catching in the dust like gold flung carelessly through the air. The town of Dry Creek, nothing more than a bent spine of weathered buildings and splintered posts, held its breath around the auction yard. Smoke drifted up from chimneys, the smell of tobacco and stale sweat clinging thick to the crowd. Boots shuffled. Coins clinked. And beneath it all ran a current of something colder than the coming winter, a quiet hunger dressed in men's eyes. They had lined the women up like livestock. No names spoken, only numbers pinned crooked to worn dresses. Some cried. Others kept their chins down. Most looked at nothing at all. But one stood straighter than the rest, hands bound in front, dark hair wind-whipped across her cheeks. 25, maybe. No jewelry, no shoes. A bruise bloomed like spilled ink under her left eye. The auctioneer barked from his stand, a rusted iron bell clutched in his fist. His voice cut through the silence like a knife. Next up, number 6. Strong frame, no children. Speak when spoken to, girl. She didn't speak. The bell clanged once more. The crowd shifted forward, eager for something to break the monotony of cattle and salt blocks and nails. A man stepped out, tall, red-faced, too well-fed for a place like Dry Creek. His hat was too clean. His eyes too cruel. He walked slow, grinning as if he'd already won her. Turn around, he ordered. She didn't. His hand cracked across her face with the sound of dried branches snapping underfoot. Her head jerked, but she didn't cry out. Didn't flinch. Just stared forward, cheek reddening, braid loosened. The crowd murmured, then stilled. Some looked down. Others smiled into their beards. She stood there, not proud, but unbroken. And that silence of hers, deeper than the well out back of town, held the moment like a prayer no one knew how to say. A few steps beyond the crowd, a man leaned against the side of the blacksmith's post. Dust clung to the knees of his trousers. His coat hung loose on a frame that once had strength but had forgotten it for a while. His beard was gray at the edges, hands thick with old calluses. He looked like someone who'd once been needed and wasn't anymore. He hadn't come for the auction. He hadn't come for much of anything. But his eyes locked on the girl, and something long buried stirred in the pit of him. Not pity. Not desire. Something older than both. Recognition. The kind you feel when you see a storm coming and remember a night years back when the wind broke your roof and left your house hollow. The auctioneer laughed nervously. Well then, gentlemen, who's got $9 and no fear of a little attitude? The red-faced man raised a hand. She's mine. Paid in full. Not quite, came the low voice from the post. Every head turned. The widower stepped forward, slow as the morning after morning. His boots sank into the dirt. He didn't look at the crowd. Only at her. He set something on the auction table. A silver coin, old, dulled. Beside it, he laid down a long rifle, well used but cared for. The red-faced man spat. What is this? She ain't worth the wood on that thing. The auctioneer shifted, uncertain. The girl blinked, for the first time looking directly at the widower. Not pleading. Not hopeful. Just watching. The man finally spoke again, quiet and hoarse like he hadn't used his voice for more than chores and grief. She's coming with me. Gasps fluttered like birds in the crowd. The auctioneer raised both hands. We got a better bid, I suppose. Rifles clean, coins real. Done deal. The red-faced man fumed, fists clenched. You'll regret this. The widower didn't answer. He just turned to her, held out a hand like it wasn't something new. She looked at it. Hesitated. Then stepped off the platform, stumbling just once before steadying. Her wrists were still bound, but she followed him without a word. They walked through the hushed crowd like two ghosts already halfway vanished from the world. Behind them, the red-faced man seethed, watching like a snake that hadn't struck yet. No one applauded. No one cheered. But the silence felt heavier than a gunshot. They reached the wagon. It was nothing grand, old wood, one horse, a cracked lantern hanging at the side. He helped her up, his hand barely brushing hers. She flinched, but only slightly. He noticed. Said nothing. As the wagon creaked forward down the road that led out of town, she turned once to look back. Not at the man who hit her. Not at the crowd. But at the windmill turning slowly beside the old church. Her eyes lingered, as if she were memorizing something she'd once dreamed of. The widower said nothing the whole way. Neither did she. The road stretched on, lined with trees half naked from wind and time. The sky had turned the color of ash. Snow would come soon. It always did. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, he was not returning to an empty home. And she was not being dragged toward another door that would not open for her. Inside the silence between them, something had been planted. Not trust. Not yet. But the beginning of it. And in the wild, that was enough to change everything. Behind them, Dry Creek settled into evening, unaware that it had just witnessed something rare, not a man buying a woman, but a soul recognizing another and refusing to let the world finish breaking it. And somewhere inside her, bruised but intact, the girl breathed easier. Not safe. Not healed. But not alone. Not anymore. The road to the cabin wound through bare-limbed trees and earth too hard for tracks. The wagon creaked with every turn of the wheel, its sound loud in the hush of oncoming winter. Frost had settled across the branches like ash, and in the quiet space between two souls who'd spoken no promises, the cold seemed to reach deeper than skin. She sat beside him, arms folded, eyes forward. Her wrists were still red where the rope had rubbed raw. She hadn't asked where they were going, and he hadn't told her. But when he'd offered her the spare blanket from under the seat, she'd taken it without a word, wrapping herself as if bracing for something colder than snow. The cabin appeared just past a narrow ridge, tucked at the edge of the trees. It wasn't large. Weather-beaten logs. A roof patched with newer wood. Smoke rising from a crooked chimney like breath from a mouth too tired to speak. One porch rail leaned slightly, and a small pile of chopped wood waited just outside the door. He slowed the horse and stepped down first. Then turned and offered a hand, not demanding, only open. She stared at it for a moment, then accepted it. The porch groaned under their weight. Inside, the room was dim, warmed only by a flickering fire. A rocking chair sat empty in the corner. A wooden table, scarred and solid, stood in the middle of the room with two chairs on either side. One was newer. The other had belonged to someone who was gone. He lit a lamp. The soft glow revealed a shelf of jars, beans and flour and salt stacked neatly. A quilt lay folded on the bed in the back corner. Beside it, a wash basin, a chipped mirror, and a set of carved wooden combs. She looked around slowly, eyes catching on the picture frame above the hearth. A woman. Gentle face. Hair pinned back. Eyes a little like his. Someone who had smiled easily, once. She said nothing, but her shoulders sank slightly, like a breath had finally made it through her chest. He busied himself without speaking, setting water to boil, slicing bread, stirring a pot that had waited all day for its ingredients. She sat at the table, hands folded in her lap. Her eyes followed his movements, cautious, measuring. Not afraid, just uncertain of what came next. He placed a bowl in front of her. Steam rose into the quiet air. She hesitated, then lifted the spoon and took a slow sip. It was hot and plain and full of potatoes. She finished it all. He ate beside her, silent, not watching her but not looking away. When the bowls were cleared, he unhooked a bundle of blankets from a peg by the door and laid them gently at the edge of the bed. Then he took a small mattress from under the table and dragged it across the floor beside the fire. She watched him prepare it. He said nothing to reassure her. There was no need. She understood. He didn't touch her, not once. Not even by accident. When he blew out the lamp, the room sank into soft darkness. The fire whispered, wind knocked gently against the walls, and the two of them lay in the same room but miles apart in memory. Sleep didn't come easily for her. It hadn't in years. But she didn't stay awake waiting for harm to find her. That was new. The next morning, she rose before him. Washed her face in cold water. Braided her hair. Found a broom leaning behind the stove and began to sweep the floor in slow, steady motions. Not as a servant. As someone trying to make sense of being somewhere safe. He awoke to the sound of bristles on wood and sat up without alarm. She paused but didn't stop. They ate again in silence. This time, he placed a small carving knife between them, then slid a half-finished piece of wood her way. A spoon, rough-edged, barely shaped. She looked at it. Then at him. He only nodded once. That afternoon, he hitched up the wagon to gather wood from the far grove. She stayed behind. When he returned, the floor had been scrubbed. The mirror cleaned. A shirt of his, mended. She hadn't left. They didn't speak. But things began to move in small, invisible ways. Each evening, she took her bowl with both hands, sat at the table across from him, and ate in peace. Sometimes she hummed, just barely, a note or two. He never interrupted. Once, she placed a small cloth she'd stitched on the windowsill. White with blue thread along the edges. No pattern. Just something of her own hands in the room. The town didn't ask much. But word travels faster than wagons. And when he returned one morning from the general store, a few eyes lingered too long. Mrs. Appleton, sharp of tongue and sharper of heart, handed him a sack of flour and said, "You're feeding two now. Just make sure she don't disappear like the last one." He didn't answer. Back at the cabin, the girl was slicing apples. She had flour on her cheek. He set the sack down and reached out, gently, hesitantly, to brush the speck away. She froze. He stepped back, palms raised. She nodded once, a barely there gesture, and turned back to the apples. Outside, the sky turned pewter. Snow hadn't yet come, but the air tasted of it. Cold that made bones remember what they'd lost. That night, she sat beside the fire while he carved. She picked up the half-made spoon and began sanding it. The sound of rasp against wood filled the space between them. He looked at her, not the way a man looks at a woman he wants, but the way a person looks at something they thought they'd never see again. She didn't speak, but she smiled. Just a little. Like it hurt to remember how. That smile stayed with him through the long dark. He stood on the porch that evening, watching the trees sway like ghosts in prayer. The stars blinked overhead, small and cold. Inside, she tidied the space, folded the quilt, then paused at the frame above the hearth. She reached up, touched it lightly, then turned and sat back down. She did not ask about the woman in the photograph. And he did not offer her story. But the way the firelight danced across both their faces said that maybe, just maybe, not all things that are broken stay that way forever. The snow came 2 days later. Soft at first, like whispers. Then heavier, blinding. It wrapped the cabin in silence deeper than words. He brought in the last of the wood. She brewed tea from dried mint and poured 2 mugs. When she handed his to him, their fingers touched, briefly. This time, she didn't pull away. And this time, neither did he. Though no words passed between them, the hush in the room felt different. Not empty. Just waiting. Like something was beginning. Slow as thaw. Quiet as breath. Real. Snow pressed against the windows like breath held too long. Outside, the world had vanished in white, soft and blinding, but inside the cabin, the fire glowed steady, amber and sure. The days had turned quieter still, not because there was nothing to say, but because they had grown comfortable in the absence of noise. She moved through the space now with familiarity, not caution. He no longer flinched at the sound of her footsteps. 2 people once broken by what they'd lost, learning to carry it without cutting themselves every time they remembered. She spoke for the first time on a wind-lashed evening in early January. He had carved 3 spoons that day, and she'd spent the afternoon sanding each until the wood felt smooth enough to be trusted. As the fire spit and cracked, she stared into it, fingers curled around her cup of tea. When she spoke, her voice was soft and dry, as if drawn from a well that had gone untouched too long. I was 16 when I married. He didn't move. I was sold for 2 mules and a stove. No one told me until the morning they loaded my things in a cart. Still, he said nothing. Not from coldness. From care. He was older. Didn't want a wife, only someone to carry water and keep warm in winter. I tried to be quiet. Useful. I bled too early 1 month and not at all the next. That was enough. The cup in her hands trembled slightly. He told his brother I was broken. They took me to the doctor, he prodded and frowned. Called me a waste. Said I might never carry a child. That was the last night I was given a bed. She didn't cry. Only looked at the fire, as if it alone had permission to see the full shape of her pain. I lived in the barn after that. 2 winters. I cooked and cleaned, and sometimes they let me inside when company came. Told me to smile, stay quiet. I did. She took a breath, not shaky but deliberate. Then they tried to sell me again. To a man with gold teeth and dirt under his nails. I refused. First time I ever said no. They beat me for it. After that, I was listed for auction. The room was so still it felt like the world outside had stopped spinning to listen. I thought maybe I'd end up with someone worse. Or maybe I'd just stop being someone at all. She looked at him then. But you didn't ask me anything. Not what I could do. Not where I'd been. He met her gaze, calm and unwavering. I didn't have to, he said, voice low, rough from disuse. You were still standing. She nodded. Not in thanks, in understanding. The next day, he taught her how to use the rifle. She had asked quietly over breakfast, her voice still tentative, like a bird unsure if the sky would hold. He didn't ask why. Only took her out past the pine line where the wind cut clean across the hilltop and set up 2 bottles on a fence post. Her hands trembled at first. He stood beside her, close enough to guide, far enough to not crowd. When the first shot cracked, it missed. The second hit the wood beneath. The third sent a bottle into 1,000 shining pieces. She didn't smile. But later, while washing the dishes, she hummed a tune he didn't recognize. The bond between them didn't announce itself. It built quietly, shared tasks, small glances, the gentle timing of steps taken side by side. He never touched her beyond what was needed. But she had begun to rest her hand lightly on the back of his chair when she passed. Not for long. Just enough to say, I know you're here. The fire within her was still cautious, but it had warmed. So had his. He had once been a husband. He had once buried a wife and half of himself with her. Since then, he had not looked at another woman the way he now sometimes looked at the girl in his cabin, not with longing, but with recognition. Not desire, but a deep ache to protect something he could never own. One evening, as the snow thickened and the sky turned a velvet blue, he returned from town with more than salt and beans. In his arms, a second-hand coat, patched, faded, but warm. He offered it to her without ceremony. She accepted it the way she did most things, silently, with eyes that saw more than she let on. Later that night, she stitched a bit of her old dress fabric into its inner lining, not for function, but to make it hers. That was how things grew between them. Not in leaps, but in seams. In pieces mended, not replaced. But not all things stayed quiet. The sheriff came knocking one morning, his boots tracking slush across the porch. "You been keeping that girl here since the auction?" he asked, voice too casual. The widower nodded once. The sheriff looked him over, then flicked a glance toward the half-open door where the girl stood, half-hidden. "Fella she was promised to, he's stirring things up. Says you robbed him. Says he means to come back with friends." The widower didn't blink. "She's not his. Doesn't much matter what's true, you know that. Men like him don't fight fair. Town's talkin'. Just keep your wits sharp." He left without further warning. Inside, the girl had closed the door gently. Her face unreadable, but her hands balled tight. "Will he come?" she asked that night. The widower nodded. "Maybe not tomorrow. But yes." She stood by the hearth, firelight casting soft gold across her face. Her voice, when she spoke again, held no tremble. "Then I stay ready." The fear wasn't gone. But it no longer ruled her. They began preparing without fanfare. Reinforced the door. Checked the rifle. Cut more wood. She practiced each day, shooting Kens off stumps until her shoulder ached. He watched her with quiet pride, never offering praise but always showing up to see. One night, she said his name. He looked up from his carving. "You never asked mine," she said. He waited. "It's not the one I was given. That name doesn't fit anymore." She knelt by the fire and whispered a new one. One she had chosen for herself. He repeated it, carefully, as if speaking something sacred. The silence after was full, but not empty. A few days later, the snow stopped. The sky cleared. But the stillness in the air shifted. Even the animals seemed to sense it. Trouble was coming. Not as a storm, but as a reckoning. And she did not flinch. She stood at the window that evening, wrapped in the coat he'd given her, hair tucked back, hands resting lightly on the sill. The rifle leaned against the wall. The fire crackled behind her. And when he looked at her, he saw not the girl from the auction block, bruised and bound, but a woman who had rebuilt herself out of silence and ash. He rose and stood beside her. No words were needed. But the quiet between them held something stronger than any vow. She turned to him, and for the first time, reached for his hand, not because she needed saving. But because she didn't. And in that moment, he knew the fire within her hadn't just survived. It had found a place to burn. ChatGPT said. It began with the silence of birds. The woods, once alive with flutter and song, had grown still. Even the wind held its breath. The girl noticed first, how the hush felt heavier than snow, how the sky turned the shade of slate long before dusk should have come. She stood at the window with the rifle resting against her hip, eyes trained on the trail that twisted down from Dry Creek like a scar through the trees. They were coming. He'd known it would happen. That a man like that wouldn't forget being humiliated in front of a crowd. Especially by someone who didn't raise his voice or his fists, only laid down coin and steel and walked away with what the other thought he owned. The widower stepped outside, checked the latch on the barn, then closed the gate around the stock. He paused by the porch, drawing in a long breath. The cold bit deep, but it was clear. Unclouded. She met him at the door. He nodded once. "It'll be soon." "How many?" "Enough to feel brave." The townsfolk had grown uneasy these last days. Mrs. Appleton had stopped her visits. Young Elias, who once came with bundles of wood and drawings in chalk, hadn't shown for 2 sunsets. Even Sheriff Cale had turned polite, too polite, asking if they had enough salt, enough oil, but never staying long enough to finish a sentence. The cabin, once a place of peace and rebuilding, now braced itself for something older, the kind of fear that smells like sweat and iron. She moved steadily through the small space. Checked the latch on the back door. Loaded the rifle, laid another near the hearth. In her new coat, with her hair braided back and boots laced tight, she looked nothing like the girl sold for $9. The storm arrived just before nightfall. They came on horseback, 5 of them, with torches lit though the sun hadn't yet set. The lead rider wore a green coat and a grin stained by whiskey and cruelty, the same man who'd raised his hand at the auction yard. The others followed with the smug confidence of men used to having their way, guns at their hips, laughter in their throats. They didn't dismount. They didn't call out names. They just circled the house once like wolves. The widower stepped onto the porch. A shadow among flames. He carried no weapon, only the weight of all he'd buried and everything he now refused to lose. Greencoat's smile widened. Thought maybe you forgot who she belonged to. She doesn't belong to anyone, the widower said, voice even. Greencoat spat in the dirt. Town don't think so. You think they'll stand with you? For her? The girl stepped out behind him. The rifle was in her hands, steady. She don't need anyone to stand for her, the widower said. She already stood for herself. She stepped beside him, not behind, and raised her voice, louder than she'd ever dared. I'm not a thing. Not a mule. Not a prize. I'm not yours. Greencoat's grin faltered. He hadn't expected that voice. Not from her. She's got fire now, he sneered. Heard you taught her to shoot. You teach her to bleed too. The rifle lifted half an inch. Say another word, she said, quiet, clear, and I'll show you what else I learned. The other men stirred. The moment teetered. Then came the sound of boots in snow. Not rough. Not hurrying. From the trail came townsfolk, first Elias, small and silent with a slingshot at his side. Then Mrs. Appleton, coat flung over her nightdress, jaw tight. Behind her, Sheriff Cale, shotgun resting on his shoulder like a warning carved from wood. More followed. Faces from the general store, from the church steps. All gathered in stillness behind the porch, not speaking, just standing. Greencoat's smirk collapsed. He looked around, eyes narrowing. Thought this was your town, the widower said. Cale took a step forward. It still is. That's why you're leaving. I paid for her. No, the sheriff said, cocking his head, you paid for humiliation. And you earned it. Greencoat shifted in his saddle. His fingers twitched toward his belt. The crowd tensed. The girl's rifle didn't waver. The moment hung there, brittle as ice. Then Elias lifted his slingshot and let fly a stone. It struck the side of Greencoat's horse with a sharp crack. The beast reared, startled, and in the scramble, the man's gun clattered to the ground. Sheriff Cale stepped forward and picked it up. No one dies today, he said flatly. But you ride out, now. And you don't come back. The men looked at each other. The spell had broken. They weren't brave without the silence of others. One by one, they turned their horses, spitting curses into the wind, and rode back toward Dry Creek. The girl's rifle lowered, but her shoulders didn't. Only when their hoofbeats had vanished into the trees did she breathe. The townsfolk lingered just long enough to let the silence settle again. Mrs. Appleton nodded once toward the girl, then turned and walked away. Elias waved, small and solemn. Sheriff Cale stayed behind. You've got friends, he said to them both. Even if they don't know how to say it yet. Then he followed the others back down the trail. The widower and the girl stood alone again on the porch, the fire behind them flickering in the grate. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He looked at her, at the way she stood now, not just unafraid but unshakable. Her hands no longer trembled when she held steel. Her voice no longer stumbled when she spoke truth. She had come through something that tried to erase her, and she had drawn a line in the snow and said, no more. He reached out, not sudden, not forceful, just quiet, and touched her hand. She didn't flinch. Inside, the fire had burned down to a warm glow. The house smelled of pine and ash, and something else, something new, like the warmth of bread not yet baked, but promised. That night, she slept with her back to the door, no rifle within reach. That night, he set down the second mattress and left it where it was. No words. No grand gestures. Just peace. Morning came slow and golden. The snow had stilled. The wind moved gently through the trees, no longer carrying dread, only breath. She stood by the window again, watching the world thaw. He stepped beside her and held out the carving knife. Knew what came in, he said. Figured you might want to start something. She took it in her hand, thumb brushing the handle. And for the first time, she smiled without shadow. What they had was not romance, not yet. It was older than that, simpler. It was two souls who had refused to let the world finish breaking them. Two lives bent, but unbowed. In each other, they found not rescue, but room. Not salvation, but stillness. And in that stillness, something real had rooted itself. Not quick. Not loud. But strong enough to stand through any storm. And maybe, in time, to bloom.